I bet you think you're John Wayne, showing up and shooting down everybody. You're classic in the wrong way, and we all know the end of the story. 'Cause everyone knows someone who kills the buzz every time they open up the mouth. Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, it's kind of detestable that the limited release rollout for Highest to Lowest, veteran auteur Spike Lee's latest film, an ambitious reimagining of High and Low, the 1963 classic of Golden Age, post-war Japanese cinema directed by Akira Kurosawa, Lee's star-studded cast of this reimagining including the likes of Denzel Washington and Jeffrey Wright. In the aftermath of finding myself kinda loving, in a quiet way, or at least fondly looking back on Living, a very similar project in that it was this English-language remake of one of Kurosawa's films, in that case a remake of Ikiru directed by Oliver Hermanus and written by Kazuo Ishiguro, I was actually pretty stoked for Highest to Lowest, even though Lee's rather spotty track record as a remaker kinda speaks for itself. But if there's one crow coming out of the film's social media, it's that this hot new trendy Spike Lee joint that they would otherwise be seeing this weekend, that this movie co-produced by the American art house distributor Apparent A24 and the Apple TV Plus streaming service. And maybe the latter says something about why this theatrical push has been screwed as much as it is. A new Spike Lee movie, especially with the A24 cosign, that should be seen as a pretty broad umbrella to put over the kind of decentralized, mainstream, but not really Main Street multiplex audience who at the very least like keeping up with the trendy new indie flicks and the international Oscar bait or whatever. But not only are people frustrated about their inability to see it, it seems that even as far as the limited release rollout to those fewer major multiplexes, Highest to Lowest wasn't even given the dignity of a Thursday night preview. And I'll definitely be looking forward to seeing Highest to Lowest when I can, but as someone who goes to the movies every week, I do have to say that as with Killers of the Flower Moon before it, Apple's distribution strategy, even for their prestige film productions, the exact sort of thing that they're hoping will get the critical and awards attention that, in spite of the severe devaluing of those institutions of film culture to a wider public over the last few years, is still pretty broadly, if you have just normal conversations with people, still an important metric by which they decide if they're going to even bother to see a certain movie or, I don't know, just watch TV and look at their phone, the glorious streaming experience. Apple's self-sabotaging background motive for clearly just wanting to make this a part of their attractive catalog that will continue to pull audiences away from the theatrical experience is spelled out perfectly in this instance. And the thing is that it ends up devaluing the pedigree of this prestige production itself, which then, of course, means there's no greater value add to the streaming experience you're trying to sell and service. And as a moviegoer who hits the theaters once a week, I can tell you, I didn't even know Spike Lee had a new movie coming out until a couple weeks ago, and it was through ads or film accounts on social media, many of which were mixed in basically with the big response of, why isn't this getting a bigger theatrical push? Meanwhile, despite having not really skimped on my art house or at least borderline stuff that would, in this case, 100% should get that limited release push into some major multiplexes for the Thursday night previews. Never saw a trailer for this movie, never even saw a theatrical trailer for the new Spike Lee movie, which, I'm sorry, I'm old enough to know who Spike Lee is. I'm into movies enough to understand his significance and pedigree as a filmmaker. I don't associate him with streaming. he's been around for a long time, I get it, and people aren't as hot on his later stuff as his early stuff. That's not rare, but I went to see Chirac and BlacKkKlansman on the big screen because the type of person that his movies appeal to the most to tend also to be the types of people who don't want to have to stream his stuff. They want to go out and see him and support his continuing of his craft into newer and newer eras on film in the cinema. But you know what trailer has been being shoved in front of my eyeballs pretty much every time I went to see an adult-oriented or even sometimes a popular Christian film that wasn't a big budget action fantasy, a reboot, or a horror film? And not just within a couple weeks, but like over the last few months? East of Wall, a docu-fictional drama set against the backdrop of the South Dakota Badlands, which marks the feature film debut as a writer-director for one Kate Beecroft, having embedded herself for 3 years on a horse rescue and training ranch owned and run by a single mother, Tabitha Zuniga, a ranch that also serves as a safe haven for several wayward and neglected tweens and teenagers, some of whom Tabitha even trains to be trick riders and to compete in youth rodeos. East of Wall serves as Beecroft's somewhat neo-realistic impression of this real-life, financially struggling, unorthodox family whose, let's say, the internal dynamic falls just a tad over the line of, like, bare minimum dysfunction. Besides Tabitha herself, some of the real-life, non-traditional performers who make up for the cast of this, again, kind of docu-fictional, impressionistic rendering of this tribe of outsiders, these include Tabitha's children, including her oldest daughter, Portia, a youth champion trick rider in her own right. Portia also provides a periodic poetical narration to the story, especially as concerns the still recent specter hanging over both of their lives, and really the life of the ranch itself, which is the passing of Tabitha's husband and Portia's father 2 years before. It'll take time before Beecroft as a filmmaker is ready to fully reveal why the circumstances of his passing was not simply untimely, but contiguous with the clearly systemic social problems plaguing the marginalized, poor, unemployed, and more often than not, racially heterodox, especially these kids that Tabitha shelters who often come from families of both Latino and indigenous Dakota descent. Deeply traumatic, and it is in this context, with the isolated Tabitha juggling so many responsibilities that others are either unable to fulfill for these kids if they haven't outright abdicated from them entirely, where Tabitha basically tries to use TikTok to promote her ranch and thus her ability to continue to rescue and sell horses. Only for the virality of that promotion to basically mean very little in her geographically and financially restricted context, where, you know, this weird, ethnically heterodox, mostly women family ranch, those very new media and heterodox culture that paints the exterior of this family, which includes bringing in the girls to horse auctions to perform trick rides with the horses, often to music of the girls' choosing, which is basically, instead of traditional country or rock, basically Spotify bro rap and zanned out trap and R&B and the like. The virality of TikTok clearly doesn't do much when the closest horse auction you can pull up to is still full of the usual centrally cast, but in this docu-fictional neo-realized take, real-life old white dudes, the faces who both we and they see as basically being symbolic or archetypical of what the rural American South and West looks and sounds like. It's in this context, seeing Portia perform at a regular auction, that Tabitha's ranch attracts the eye of a carpetbagging, city-slicking rich boy from Fort Worth, Texas. That would be Roy Waters, played by Scoot McNairy, who, along with Jennifer L., portraying a fictionalized version of Tabitha's mother and Portia's grandmother, makes up one of only two prominent, recognizable faces in this dramatic story of what turns out to be a minor bargain with the devil.
Clearly more intent on closing a strange, inappropriately paternal relationship with Portia, Waters makes a show of buying one of Tabitha's horses for $7,000, far in excess of what she's usually able to sell her rescues for, and doing far more to boost her profile, or rather her portfolio as a real seller, than however many years of viral promotion going right over the heads of the markets that Tabitha is already financially restricted to selling at. He then arrives at Tabitha's ranch and makes her an offer. Let him buy the ranch. He'll sell the horses. Tabitha sticks to what she knows best. Tabitha is, of course, not willing to commit immediately, but she and Waters basically have a handshake deal, taking over the running of the ranch for a trial period within which he will be taking Tabitha's horses and Portia to more fertile auctions for her horses where she can make more money. But of course, even this trial proves destabilizing, basically giving Portia a surprising new independent streak in her sense of her own life and what she can contribute to the ranch, but still ripping her away from being able to compete in the rodeos. And I don't want to say something glib like, of course, this all leaves the lingering wounds of unresolved trauma there to fester, because I think one of the things that I really like about a small, regionally based, and in just what type of personalities that a movie like East of Wall profiles, which is to say, somewhat anachronistic to even our 21st century view of the rural American South and West. One of the things that I really like about it is that East of Wall is just kind of too serious as a fully lived in, sort of capsule biographical portrait of its subjects, that even as Beecroft obviously engages in not just some liberties in terms of constructing a story, casting bigger name actors, and of course in a kind of, again, neo-realistic but romantic style in which she and cinematographer Austin Shelton visually portray not just the characters, but the panorama of the Badlands that surrounds them. Even for all that, East of Wall is just kind of too serious in its intentions to not just vaguely empower these characters as like the new faces of traditional Americana, where the story feels behooved to go in certain directions that aim to resolve whatever the crisis of the story is, including the trauma experienced by these characters. It's too serious a production and optimistically too collaborative in Beecroft's working with Tabitha and Portia and their whole unorthodox family to act like the fundamental nature of trauma, which is not something to be dramatically resolved or fixed or pruned really from a character or personality, like it's something we need to see them overcome so that we get to have a nice sense of catharsis from the inevitability of being bombarded by this compounding evidence of how much of these characters' lives is informed not just by the recent past, but like by over a century of settler persecution, and then deeply inscribed lines of race and gender, and then systemic poverty, and then the profligacy of the experience of incarceration, drug and alcohol abuse, abuse within families and relationships, and of course, deaths of despair. East of Wall is just a little too clearly, I hate to say such an inadequate and overused word, but like authentic feeling as a painting of these characters and where they come from, to not be like, no. Trauma doesn't get resolved. Trauma is all around us. And there's a particularly magnetic scene where Tabitha and some of her old friends and friends of her mother get together for a night of drinking in the barn that ends with like this therapeutic roundtable confession of all of the darkest things they've not only experienced, but like done themselves, and even things they've felt and they've thought that has informed so much of their lives. If nothing else, East of Wall, it's a movie that is thematically about how, in a weird way, one way that you often keep people down and caged in and isolated is by like almost establishing the resolution, or rather the forgetting, the overwriting of trauma as a transactional thing. Like they need to get over it to succeed, to be respected, to be accepted, to have their talents recognized and be seen as worthy of success. Don't just keep carrying that chip around on your shoulder, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I really think the fictionalization of this Roy Waters part that McNary portrays was a really ingenious move on Beecroft's part, and it's very nice how she incorporates our growing understanding of this, what in a more routine Western movie might have been framed as a more one-dimensionally antagonistic character. It's nice how Beecroft incorporates a growing exploration of his background and his motives, and how they intersect with exactly that theme of the kind of separation between a culture that valorizes success and overwrites trauma, as opposed to what East of Wall focuses on, which, besides the marginality of Tabitha and Portia's family in strictly material terms, it is this idea that no, we come from a tradition where success is just a means to an end, but it's not what makes your life worth it, and where actually we do more to remember our trauma and to tell this ongoing story of our losses and of our experiences, because it's inseparable from who we are and who we are becoming. It can't be cut away from us without severing our connection to that history, who we are. Again, that theme very much tracking with the dramatic allegory of this rich guy offering these ladies success, but in exchange for their land. And I also don't want to paint the picture of East of Wall being some kind of dour trauma porn, but I think at its heart, it is kind of a feel-good movie, and it is interesting when I consider this as part of a trend I see, especially in American independent cinema, where whether it's something like East of Wall or last year's Notice to Quit or Tokyo Cowboy, even if these independent films will have a more artisanal style or be plugged into a more limited network of film culture and appreciation of film made outside of the mainstream, there is this definite sense that a lot of American independent dramas are not just any longer servicing the desire of a boutique market for, again, something that isn't a mainstream production with all these recognizable faces or these high concept premises, but also kind of servicing what I hope is a growing fatigue of even more general audiences, people who are not even especially movie people, for the kinds of low to mid-budget dramas that even major distributors, even within just the last few decades, used to co-produce and give a mainstream release all the time, and were a much bigger part of our cinematic culture well into the early aughts, as opposed to now where really it mostly is just big budget fantasy or reboots or horror films, or when those sorts of films do get made, very often just seem to be significantly dipping in terms of their overall production quality, where you're not sure if you're going into an adult drama or even a romance or a comedy film, whether made for theaters or for streaming, you're not sure if it's going to all just end up looking like the same movie, just differently cast episodes of a Peanuts streaming show, not even a prestige streaming show. There was a time where adult-oriented dramas and adult-oriented romantic films, and even comedies to a certain extent, even family comedies, they were still really well shot. There was this intention of making them look like something you couldn't do for TV. Besides being fascinating, besides being emotionally engrossing, and besides providing this lushly photographed, unapologetically sympathetic, lived-in window into a version of Americana that, even within independent films, isn't often represented outside of variations on the same face of a stoic, stridently independent white man fighting against obstacles, and not really describing a setting, its feeling, and the diverse kinds of people who actually live there and what their lives are like. East of Wall isn't necessarily an outstandingly impressive debut, but I do think it is a very good film for all of those reasons. The well-crafted story, the dynamic cinematography, especially anything involving horses, and the magnificent, sometimes even terrifying natural beauty of the Badlands, the methods by which Beecroft went about living with and collaborating with these real people to make a heightened story, again, not about overcoming some obstacle in a more classically Western story of overcoming adversity, but in sort of lightly poetically tracing this alternative kind of narrative that is more about preserving and remembering traumas and obstacles as constants of a human experience. That idea that that is what instills growth and strength in people and allows this unorthodox family to band together in the first place. Not to overcome an obstacle, not to succeed in some material sense, but just to do that, just to band together because that's what they are impelled to do by their nature as people. I'm more than happy to give this film an above average recommendation. I'm giving East of Wall a 3.5 out of 5. With that, I'm tapping out. Thank you so much for staying with this whole video, and don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.